Good afternoon. Welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies and our conversation on the role of the private sector in democracy, and particularly the 2023 Summit for Democracy. I'm Marty Flax. I'm the Khosravi Chair and Principal of Internationalism and the Director of the Human Rights Initiative here at CSIS, and I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. On Friday, February 3rd, the State Department released a call to the private sector to advance democracy, inviting companies to join efforts by governments and civil society organizations to, quote, advance an affirmative agenda for democratic renewal and tackle the greatest threats faced by democracies today. They invited business to share with them the work they are already undertaking to support democracy and human rights, and to announce new initiatives and commitments at the summit. Here to talk about what the administration hopes to get out of this initiative and what engagement with companies is envisioned over the next 2 months and beyond is the lead summit organizer at the NSC and a team of experts from the US government, as well as some outside voices who can speak to their perspective on how businesses might engage. Before we do that, however, let me just offer a couple of framing remarks for our conversation. In both 2021 and 2022, the Edelman Trust Barometer found that companies are the most trusted institution, more trusted than civil society, more trusted than the media, and more trusted by government in the dozens of countries in which they surveyed their citizens. This finding was frankly surprising to me, but it speaks to the breadth and impact that the private sector has on society, and in particular on the development and resilience of democracy and democratic institutions. This starts with how companies engage with and treat their own workers, as well as workers in their supply chains, and extends to their customers, their users, their local communities, and communities they rely on to supply their materials, and of course, their broader societies. We know that what happens at work often extends into communities, whether that's civic education that facilitates civic participation, worker organizing that builds skills for and lays the groundwork for social movements, or fair and equitable wages that build healthier and more engaged communities. We also know that company voices are powerful influencers, and that when companies speak up for respect for rule of law, anti-corruption, free and fair elections, freedom of the press, and the safety of human rights defenders, governments listen. And so it's imperative that we bring the private sector into the conversation about democracy, both here at home and all around the world. And so I'm really thrilled to be having this conversation today and helping to launch a larger conversation going forward on this topic. I'm going to introduce each of our speakers as they ask them the first question. We will then move into a Q&A session. I'll ask a few initial questions, then I'm going to open the Q&A to the audience because I really want those participating in today's webinar to ask their questions and share their thoughts as we go forward. I'm going to start with Johnny Walsh. Johnny currently serves as the coordinator for the Summit for Democracy at the National Security Council, where he is on loan from his role as a Deputy Assistant Administrator at USAID, overseeing the Center for Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance. Johnny previously served in government in a wide range of foreign policy roles and has expertise working on Pakistan, across the Arabian Peninsula and North Africa. He has a master's degree in Middle Eastern Studies and a bachelor's in international history from Harvard University. Johnny, thank you so much for being here and for leading this initiative to engage business. And I want you to start by just telling us a bit more about the motivation behind this call for engagement in the summit process, how you envision engagement with the private sector over the next 2 months, and what concretely you hope businesses will bring to the table. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you, Marty and CSIS, for bringing us together. I'll apologize to all assembled for the sort of idiosyncratic iPhone setup that I'm trying to make work here. The limitations of comms within the White House can be kind of funny. I'll say, first of all, since we all have different baselines on this topic, that reinvigorating democracy around the world is an enormous priority for this administration. That is born of the fact, and I think we're all aware of in some measure, that democracy has come under attack. Its institutions have been weakened in lots of parts of the world, but that has also had this galvanizing effect as the democratic actors around the world have realized we need to band together and protect this form of government that we believe in from often very cynical attacks on it. And so the Summit for Democracy, we held the first one just over a year ago. It was kind of the signature event of the first year of the Biden presidency, at least foreign policy event. And now we're doing a second one. And this will gather 120 countries. 5 countries will co-host, not just the United States. It will gather civil society and foundations, activists of every sort. And with respect to the private sector, I think that we pulled the first one together very quickly, and there was for all the right reasons, I think. But while there was a private sector role, one of the main takeaways for us was that we wanted to have something more mindful to systematically incorporate private sector actors who wanted to be involved. And so the basic concept here starts with the call that the State Department put out that you referred to, and that's scriptural for us at this point. What we're asking is that companies who are interested consider making some form of commitment, or at least entering into a process to explore one, that we could platform and elevate at the summit itself. That, I realize that's 6-7 weeks away. We're modest on our expectations. And just as when we ask governments to make commitments, we're not asking them to rewrite their constitutions. We're asking them to do something generally helpful to the cause of democracy, either at home or internationally. And likewise for companies, you can look at the many examples, which are meant to be illustrative, like creativity triggers, not meant to limit the universe of possibilities, but the many examples in the call. You'll also hear from my colleagues and partners later on what this might look like. But broadly speaking, we're trying to focus commitments, again, not exclusively, but on 4 areas. It's the relationship between technology and democracy, it's anti-corruption, it's the protection of civic space, and it's the advancement of labor rights. And so for each, we're working with a great organization in 3 of the 4 cases, an outside organization, to help bring together companies that are interested in participating, making some form of commitment, elaborating on something they're currently doing. You'll hear from them, but it's the Global Network Initiative for the Tech Effort. State Department and USAID are themselves running the anti-corruption one. The BSR and CSIS itself are running the civic space one, and the American Apparel and Footwear Association is running the labor one. So between now and the summit, for each of those, there would be a roundtable sort of convening to talk about what this would look like. And both we and those organizations in varying degrees can work with you on what would be, what would be the right kind of commitment that would work for you and seem to fit the themes of the summit. This would all culminate in a signature event on March 28th, which is effectively the opening day of the summit, where I would expect senior USG participation. CSIS has kindly agreed to host that event. We're still pulling together what the exact modalities will be, but the concept would be that we would elevate and uplift, especially the most ambitious or promising or relevant of the commitments that have come forward. And then we would pair that with a written release of what everyone has committed to. So there can be some back and forth between now and then. There's admittedly a little bit of building the plane while flying it. But I would just say we are not conceiving of this or any other part of the summit as ending on March 28th or 29th and 30th, the other days of the event. We wanted to start a process, and we intend to stay engaged, especially on this. It dovetails with a lot of other work that we're doing about the nexus between democracy, human rights, and private sector business activity. And we want to be helpful. And in some cases, there will be ways in which something we're doing can dovetail with something you're doing. And, in a happy scenario, it can be more than the sum of our parts. So I'll be quiet for now, and you'll hear much more, especially about the 4 lines of effort from the future speakers. That's the basic concept of how we'd like to hopefully work with enthusiastic partners among you. Over.
Thanks so much, Johnny. I really appreciate that. And we'll definitely circle back around to some of the details about how companies can engage. But I want to keep framing the discussion first. And I want to turn to Scott Busby and hear from him, because Scott, you've been working on these issues for many, many years. Scott is the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the Department of State, where he oversees, in addition to all of their work on business and human rights-based sanctions. He also works on East Asia and the Pacific and the Western Hemisphere. He previously served as a director for human rights on the National Security Council as well as working on migration and refugee issues. And Scott, I want to turn to you to put this initiative a little bit in context for us and talk about how it intersects with and engages with some of the initiatives underway by the U.S. government to focus on the role of the private sector in human rights and democracy.
Thanks a lot, Marty, and thanks to everyone for joining today. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the critical role that business plays in advancing democratic values and human rights. You are a critical partner in advocating for, among other things, transparent, responsive, and accountable governance, rule of law, and respect for human rights. And I hope that you will continue to partner with us in this effort. I'm going to speak, as Marty said, to some of the work that we at the State Department are doing on these issues, which you may all want to plug into. First, let me talk about the work we're doing on addressing closing civic space and protecting human rights defenders. Civic space obviously is essential to maintaining good governance, to strengthening rule of law, and enabling citizens to exercise their human rights. In a protected civic space, human rights defenders are able to mobilize and press for transparency and accountability from their governments. And in accomplishing these objectives, close coordination with the private sector is crucial. In terms of the actions we're taking on these issues, we've put out public guidance to our diplomatic missions around the world on what they should be doing to support civil society and human rights defenders. Among other things, we've asked them to convene business and civil society actors to address human rights issues in any given country. And we'd asked you to consider working with stakeholders on the ground as you all try to address these same issues. In addition, this spring, we will take on the chair of the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights. It's actually the original multi-stakeholder initiative involving business and human rights. And it equips companies in the extractive sectors with practical guidance and tools to provide security for their operations in a manner that respects human rights. And within the context of this initiative, one of our priorities is advancing the protection of human rights defenders. And we will be working with companies involved in that process to discuss ways they are protecting human rights defenders, including how they deploy security around their extractive sites and other local operations, as well as broader efforts they might undertake to protect civic space. Let me now move to the second big topic, which Johnny mentioned, which is harnessing technology for good, for democratic good, as it were. Ensuring that technology advances democratic renewal and is not misused for anti-democratic purposes is a super high priority for the Biden administration. And I want to highlight three areas where we're working on these issues. First is on strengthening data privacy. Some of you may have tuned into the State of the Union last night, and you would have heard the president call for imposing stronger transparency requirements on big tech platforms and bipartisan support for imposing strong limitations on targeted advertising and the collection of personal data. So these are issues that the administration is going to continue to work on. They are part and parcel of the administration's principles for enhancing competition on technology platform accountability, which was released last year. As the president noted last night in State of the Union, as well as in a Wall Street Journal op-ed that was published on January 11th, there's a need for more transparency regarding collection and use of personal data and stronger protection for those who may be vulnerable online. So we're eager to work with technology platform providers in seeing what more we can do in this space to address those issues. The second big issue in tech that we're working on is surveillance technologies. We at the department, pursuant to announcements made in conjunction with the first summit, are working to develop guiding principles that illustrate how governments can maintain their commitments to protecting democratic principles and human rights in their judicious use of surveillance technology. This work complements the guidelines on surveillance due diligence that we issued a couple of years ago, the State Department issued, and we'd encourage the private sector to review those guidelines. And perhaps one way of contributing to the summit is demonstrating concretely how you are following these guidelines in your own work. The third technology issue we're addressing is the misuse of technology to attack and silence human rights defenders. Online attacks often pave the way for real-life human rights abuses. through something called the US-EU Trade and Technology Council that some of you have probably heard of. We recently launched a multi-stakeholder consultative process to develop public guidance on how tech companies can work with civil society and other stakeholders to prevent, mitigate, and address online attacks against human rights defenders. We will be convening a second consultation this coming week, actually, with business about these issues. And if you'd like to join, feel free to reach out to us and we can send you an invitation. I would urge you in particular to be in touch with Hanan Weissman or Jenny Stein on my teams. And if you don't have their contact information, Marty can provide it to you. I wanted to close with a discussion of the work we're doing on reinvigorating a national action plan on responsible business conduct. As some of you may be aware, towards the end of the Obama administration, the executive branch issued its first ever so-called NAP. Didn't have a lot of ambitious stuff in it, and it was the end of the administration, but it was a start. We are now trying to re-energize that NAP, and we're doing so in consultation with civil society, businesses, and others. Secretary Blinken announced our intent to do this back in June of 2021, which was the 10-year anniversary of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. We've received lots of stakeholder feedback through broad consultations over the last 18 months, and we're currently coordinating with our colleagues in the interagency to pull together that feedback and come up with a set of commitments that we would make as a government to address these issues. We hope to share more on this by the time of the second summit and are hopeful that we can release the NAP before the end of this calendar year. So those are some of the things that we're working on here at the State Department. We would love to have you partner with us. We'd be happy to brainstorm with you on what you might do to demonstrate your fealty to democracy and human rights, and happy to address any questions you may have. I unfortunately have to drop off at 2, Marty, but you can, Johnny, I think will be able to answer any questions that might come up. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Scott. Really appreciate that overview, particularly of some of the priority areas that state is thinking about. I do want to delve now into some of those topics that Johnny flagged as priorities in this call for engagement. And I want to start with labor issues, because this is an area where there is obviously an enormously important role for the private sector and a lot of discussion about human rights and labor rights. But I'm going to turn to Molly McCoy to help us pull that thread a little bit from the human rights conversation into the democracy conversation. And let me introduce Molly. Molly is the Associate Deputy Undersecretary for the Bureau of International Labor Affairs at the U.S. Department of Labor. Before joining DOL, she served as the Policy Director at the Solidarity Center, where she developed and led congressional outreach on international worker and human rights issues. She also was the Regional Program Director for the Americas at the Solidarity Center. So years of experience in this conversation about labor rights. Molly, as I said, help us pull the thread a little bit from the work that companies and governments are doing on labor rights into how that plays into the conversation about democracy and democratic resilience. And then what specifically, or as concretely as you can, would you like to see from companies in terms of their engagement on this topic in the summit process? Thanks.
Thanks, Marty, and thank you again to CSIS for pulling us all together. We're really excited to see so much enthusiasm and interest on the part of the private sector, in particular on labor rights. And as the generators of jobs, we see private sector partners as having both an accountability, a responsibility for promoting and protecting worker rights. And so I'm happy to talk a little bit about how we see that interacting with democracy. I mean, I will start at the sort of very fundamental level of labor rights as enabling inclusion and participation in democratic societies. And I don't want to get too academic about it, but what we see when workers have their rights at work, when they have a voice, when they have safe, healthy workplaces that are free from democracy and obviously free from child labor, forced labor, they're in a position of stability that then enables them to be active, involved citizens in their communities. They can run for office, they can lead campaigns, they can hold their governments accountable. if they have freedom of association and the backing of a union or a democratic workers organization, they have the security in their jobs to denounce corruption. And I know we're going to get into that conversation in just a little bit. Unions and workers organizations have a tremendous role to play in protecting whistleblowers. And when workers are organized and when they have the confidence and the rights at work to speak out, they can take on really daunting issues, both in their workplaces as well as globally. So we've seen in the last 2 years an international campaign that's been led by workers on gender-based violence and harassment in the workplace. And that's the sort of issue that for anyone who has faced that, and that's a lot of people, is very frightening, very daunting, and very unlikely to be successful if you're on your own. But in workplaces where workers have the right to speak out, where they have the protection to do so, they can take that on and make change. I think what I want to focus on here is the right to freedom of association and collective bargaining, because I think it's very hard to find anyone who's going to speak in favor of child labor or forced labor discrimination or even unsafe workplaces. But freedom of association is a very frequently violated right, even here. I know Scott mentioned the State of the Union yesterday. Those who watched it heard the president call out people who are working to prevent workers from organizing. And he underscored the right of workers to join a union. We see freedom of association as an enabling right in democracies. I think, Marty, at the outset, you mentioned just the very basic democratic practices that workers gain when they're able to join unions, elect leaders, develop shared priorities, and negotiate peacefully with employers or authorities. We see freedom of association as very critical to allowing regular citizens and workers to channel their voices into important local and national policy making and debates. So things like just transition and the switch to a greener economy isn't something you can just leave up to an election every 2 or 4 years, but it's something where you want engagement, buy-in, participation from all sectors of society, including workers. And finally, I want to highlight the role of unions themselves as part of a vibrant civil society. In a lot of countries, they're the biggest civil society organizations in their best representation. They're inclusive grassroots organizing that reach people at work and organize them along common interests, sometimes just very bread and butter issues, instead of along ethnic, religious, or gender lines. And we can see that around the world. In Ethiopia, for example, the Confederation of Trade Unions of Ethiopia, or Confederation of Ethiopian Trade Unions, CETU, is an inclusive, grassroots, mass-based civil society organization. And it's the only one that is in all 9 ethnic states, that it intentionally includes ethnic parity in its leadership. And in a country where ethnic tensions run high, to have a civil society organization like that based on shared economic interests is extremely important in being able to build support for democracy. We've seen it in Iraq as well, where there are unions that are both Sunni and Shia that have directly engaged with the government on labor law. And more recently, you've seen unions on the front lines in places like Myanmar, where unfortunately the majority of labor leaders are in exile, but they played an important role in standing up against the coup d'etat and mobilizing other citizens against authoritarianism. That often makes workers' organizations sort of de facto resistance, the fact that they can mobilize citizens along common interests instead of shared identity. And they're a natural target for authoritarians. We see that worker rights are some of the most violated set of human rights. And unfortunately, and this is where I want to turn to the role of the private sector, it's very easy to deflect responsibility for these rights, especially in complex supply chains or sort of unmonitored economic sectors. Governments can easily say, well, that's just the business that's operating here. And unfortunately, we do see businesses saying, well, that's the reality of the environment in which we're operating. So that's why we see the commitments that come out of this call to action is so important, that the private sector can take action, not just by sort of holding itself accountable and saying that we commit to these principles, but by taking real actions to promote worker rights across their operations, and in particular in supply chains.
Thanks so much, Molly. Really helpful overview. And I'm sure in the question and answers, we're going to dig into some details as well. But let me now bring in Shannon Green into the conversation. Shannon is the Senior Advisor to the Administrator and Executive Director of the Anti-Corruption Task Force at USAID. Shannon was previously the Senior Director of Programs at the Center for Civilians in Conflict, Civic, which many of you know. And her previous positions include mine, literally in this chair as the former Director and Senior Fellow at the Human Rights Initiative here at CSIS, as well as Senior Director for Global Engagement at the National Security Council, among many other positions. And Shannon, I want to bring you in on the topic of anti-corruption. Obviously, you're doing this work day to day at USAID across all sectors. But, this is another area where the role of the private sector is in some ways perfectly obvious. And the important role that they play is probably central to your work anyways. We don't have to convince anyone on this call that corruption is corrosive to democracy. I think if you're watching this webinar, you've probably figured that piece out. But tell us more concretely beyond the obvious things, which are, abide by the law, don't engage in corruption yourself. What would you like to see companies do to be more proactive and more engaged and more committed as part of the summit process in the realm of anti-corruption? Thanks.
Thank you, Marty. And I have to say that you're doing a great job in that chair. So congratulations, and it's great to see you and to be back at CSIS. So as you rightly pointed out, the cost of corruption on democracy are undeniable, as is the very important role that the private sector has to play in countering corruption. So as you mentioned, we are seeking common cause with those in the private sector who share our values, and who recognize that corruption disadvantages those who are able to succeed on a level playing field, both locally and across global markets. So we do think that there are a multitude of ways that the private sector could be more proactive and more active in the fight against corruption. And so I'll speak to just a couple of those. The first is internal, right? So it's always about getting our own house in order. The private sector can ensure that it has very strong anti-corruption and transparency and accountability measures within its internal business practices. For example, we've seen a number of companies really step up and commit to strengthening their internal controls to prevent fraud, or in some cases, establishing senior leadership positions that are focused on ethics and leading with integrity or the intolerance of corruption. And so that's a really good practice that we would like to encourage. The second is about influence. So the private sector in many places has quite a bit of influence because of its market power. And we would like to see companies kind of using that influence to champion the kinds of anti-corruption reforms and ethical business practices that could have knock-on effects across the entire environment. So an example of this would be insisting that their suppliers root out corruption in their supply chains, or penalizing vendors that are engaged in offering or accepting bribes. So we have found that the private sector can influence corruption in ways that are really positive, but also in ways that are negative. And so we'd like to see obviously more engagement on incentivizing that kind of behavior that has a lot of integrity. And then the third is really using the expertise to support anti-corruption champions and reformers. There are a number of private sector entities that have really good practices and knowledge and technology and tools that we would like to see them provide to other actors, including small and medium enterprises, governments, and civil society, that those stakeholders could use to strengthen their own anti-corruption work. And we're seeing increasingly a recognition that some of those tools and approaches are transferable, and we should just be more intentional about sort of pushing them out and sharing them. And then the final one is really about identifying and advocating for improvements in the business enabling environment that we as diplomats and people who program foreign assistance can use to sort of better target our engagements. And the idea here is who has a better sense of what is inhibiting private sector investment in various environments in the private sector. And so really sort of partnering with us to identify what those improvements are, and then making sure that we're sort of aware of those near-term and real-time opportunities to engage. I think most importantly, as you're hearing from my colleagues, The idea is that we need to work together, the private sector, government, and civil society. And that, as Johnny said, is really what we're trying to do through the Summit for Democracy process. During the first summit in 2020, oh my gosh, it was 2021. The State Department and USAID announced two presidential initiatives, or two initiatives within the Presidential Initiative on Democratic Renewal, that were really about strengthening collective action and engaging the private sector to better fight corruption. So the first was the State Department Bureau for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, INL, announced the global initiative to galvanize the private sector as partners in fighting corruption. If you cannot remember the full title, just refer to it as GPS. And essentially what GPS is a platform for public-private dialogue, collective action, and capacity building. And we can talk about that more. USAID also announced our Countering Transnational Corruption Grand Challenge, which I'll just refer to as the Grand Challenge, which is really about leveraging the knowledge and expertise of a variety of stakeholders, including the private sector, to engage in collective problem solving and to source innovative solutions to curb the threat of transnational corruption. Under both GPS and the Grand Challenge, we're identifying ways that the US government can really work hand in hand with the private sector to achieve our anti-corruption goals. And then finally, there's one more opportunity, which is the Financial Transparency and Integrity Cohort, Democracy Cohort, which the US government is co-leading with the Brookings Institution and OGP. That's a multi-stakeholder platform to galvanize collective action of issues that are of critical importance to the private sector, including beneficial ownership transparency, accountable procurement processes, and mitigating the role of professional enablers and facilitating corruption. So all of these are opportunities for the private sector to join forces with us and counter corruption. In mid-March, INL and USAID are hosting a roundtable with private sector entities to establish a coordination mechanism and to identify where the private sector can make genuine, concrete commitments to combating corruption. And again, those will be joining GPS, partnering on the Grand Challenge, and sharing other ideas and commitments. So if anybody is interested in joining the roundtable or having a one-on-one consultation and thinking through how you might be able to, participate and plug in, please do feel free to get in touch via summitprivatesector@state.gov.
Thank you, Shannon, and thanks for being the first one to read out the email. I'm sure Johnny will do it a few more times before we wrap up. So before we turn to our non-governmental participants, I just want to say we're already getting a few questions in the Q&A box, which is great. For folks who are listening, if you do have a question you want to pose to the group, we'll turn to those in just a few minutes. So please do put them into that chat box and we will try and ask them of our participants. Before we do that, though, I just want to turn to a couple of folks who are not coming from the US government, but who work closely with companies. And we wanted to get the perspective, particularly of organizations that engage daily with the private sector, both on the call to action itself, but also on what they think their member companies or the companies that they work with ways they could potentially engage. And so we've got two fantastic experts who will also talk about their subject matter expertise in line with the four priorities that Johnny laid out. So I'm going to start with Jason Pielmeyer. Jason's the executive director of the Global Network Initiative. This is a multi-stakeholder human rights collaboration that works on the advancement of freedom of expression and privacy among technology companies, academics, human rights and press freedom groups, and socially responsible investors. Jason's been at GNI in several capacities, including as deputy director and policy director. And before that, he served at the State Department as a special advisor in the Internet Freedom Business and Human Rights section in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Jason, I would love to hear from you. First, your reaction to this call for engagement, how you see this from the outside and how you think businesses will react. And then in the sphere that you work on, which is in the realm of technology, what opportunities you see for companies to concretely engage in line with the priorities that both Johnny and Scott laid out. Thanks.
Thank you, Marty, and to CSIS for convening this conversation, inviting me to participate. I think, echoing others and just saying your leadership role here is critical and really appreciated. I'm also very appreciative, and want to just kind of stay down front of the US government's leadership on democracy and human rights, including through the Summit for Democracy process. I'm really glad to see, in particular, a more developed focus on both technology and the private sector around this year's follow-up summit, S4D2. With regard to the call to action specifically, at a general level, I thought it was interesting that the document in the kind of preambular section really highlights the business case for democracy, and pointing out how democracies create an environment that is enabling for business, which is of course true and important. But it was just notable that the document didn't really emphasize the rights-based and kind of moral case for companies to be supporting democracy and engaging in building democracy in places where they may be active, where democracy isn't quite as established or is needs reinforcement. With respect to some of the kind of more specific examples of the commitments that are tied to the misuse of technology, I recognize that those are just illustrative examples, but I just thought there were a couple initial reactions that I wanted to share. First, as the executive director of the world's leading multi-stakeholder initiative focused on tech and human rights, whose companies commit to implementing human rights due diligence, the references in those suggestive commitments on multi-stakeholderism and demonstrating human rights due diligence, collaboration with civil society, those are all music to my ears, and I know will be for our members and our member companies as well. And that's especially important for democratic governments to continue to reiterate, specifically the importance of multi-stakeholderism when it comes to tech and tech governance at a time when authoritarian governments are really becoming much more assertive. And frankly, a time where some companies, not GNI members, are scaling back on their engagement with civil society. So really applaud that, and I think that will be important to feature in the summit and the associated events. Second, there's some notable tensions, I think, among some of these recommendations that I just think are illustrative of where there's perhaps more work to be done, and where the US government has an opportunity to enhance collaboration with democratic allies so that they can collectively provide greater consistency and clarity to the private sector. For instance, it's great to see the focus on user privacy, and the privacy enhancing protocols is the language here, which I read as a euphemism for encryption. And that makes total sense, since privacy is anathema to authoritarian control and critical to democracy, not to mention security. However, we are seeing more and more democratic governments around the world impose legal obligations on companies to conduct general monitoring of content, trace the origins of content, or engage in forms of user authentication that can limit or undermine privacy or the use of encryption. And so that's a tension that we need to acknowledge and try and work through collectively with democratic governments and rights respecting companies. Similarly, while the call for companies to commit to strengthening platform responses to individuals reporting threats, violence, or other serious violations of company terms of service with risk to bodily harm, that's a quote, is laudable and certainly understandable. The suggestion that this should be done, again quoting, by implementing swift takedown requests while platforms assess or verify the reports, in other words, taking content down before assessing or verifying the underlying complaint, fails to recognize, I think, the ways in which authoritarian actors, and here I'm not just talking about governments, but also other bad actors, sometimes use these reporting mechanisms to abuse the sort of intent and purpose of those mechanisms, and in order to stifle critical speech by dissidents, by minority groups, by journalists, et cetera. So those are just some of the tensions that I think of, that are not new to the conversation around tech and democracy, but that I think will be useful to use this platform to try and engage on. Finally, there are other topics that I know companies will be eager to feature and engage with governments on, including through this process, that are not mentioned. In particular, one example is internet shutdowns, which has been a key pillar of the work of the tech cohort that has been set up and led by the UK and Estonian governments in the kind of interregnum period between the summits, and which has had healthy company participation. So overall, again, really pleased with US government leadership here, very excited to help facilitate more engagement with tech companies on some of these commitments. I'm looking forward to hosting a roundtable with some of our USG colleagues and company representatives ahead of the summit.
Thanks, Jason. And thank you for the thoughtful responses also to the particular kind of tech pieces in the call for engagement. I know the administration will appreciate that feedback and hopefully launch a larger discussion with companies. We've got one more speaker I want to turn to for a really important piece of this, and it's really the one that I think Johnny and Scott both started, which is the civic space conversation. And for that, I want to turn to Jenny Vaughn. Jenny is the managing director of BSR. She leads BSR's human rights team and portfolio across consulting and collaboration. She also directs BSR's human rights working group. Prior to that, she worked at Mercy Corps for over a decade and has a tremendous amount of experience engaging companies in exactly the issues that we're talking about. So Jenny, I want to turn to you. One, again, would love to get your reactions to the call to engagement and how you think companies will react to it. But in particular, to speak to this question of how companies engage on issues of civic freedoms and how companies can support them, because this can be kind of an amorphous issue. It can also quickly become a politicized issue. And I would really love to hear from you kind of what you think the expectations of companies should be in engaging in this space and how they can engage in the summit process in this context. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Marty. And a final round of thanks to CSIS for hosting this. And thanks as well to the participants who have taken the time to come. It's lovely seeing so many familiar names in that participant list. So the call to the private sector to advance democracy, I really see this as an opportunity for companies to play a proactive role in shaping a society that enables justice, economic inclusion, and fundamental freedoms and rights. In the business and human rights world, we are often thinking about do no harm. That is, what can companies do to prevent human rights abuses? That is, to prevent harm to people through their business activities. This responsibility, of course, is laid out in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights that were referred to earlier. These are the leading global standard on business and human rights. We're seeing them echoed in emerging legislation and reporting standards that are increasingly aligned with the UNGPs. But I think we often forget that sometimes the most powerful way that companies can impact people, for good or for ill, is through their impact on society. So my hope is that companies will read this call to the private sector to advance democracy as an opportunity to partner with the US government and other governments, with civil society, and with other companies to take action to foster an enabling environment for civic engagement, political participation, freedom of thought and expression, and human rights broadly. All of the factors that ultimately underpin justice, peace and stability, and democracy. Let me say a few words about civic freedoms and how companies can support them. Civic freedoms or civil liberties, these include a number of human rights that essentially enable people to participate in public and political life, to gather, to communicate, to protest, to express their opinions, and to participate in groups to influence politics and society more broadly. These include rights related to freedom of association, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression. We can think about companies' roles in supporting civic freedoms by considering the different roles that companies play in society and the variety of pathways through which companies impact human rights, including these civil rights. So through their own operations and their role as an employer, through their business relationships with suppliers and customers, and of course, through political engagement, advocacy, lobbying, political contributions, membership in trade associations. Companies can take steps to support civic freedoms through all of these pathways. So for example, in their role as employers, by enabling their employees to participate in political life, for example, by providing time off for voting. Companies can set expectations with their suppliers and other business partners that they should act in a way that respects these civil liberties and other human rights. Companies, of course, can use their influencing powers to approach governments either publicly or privately to advocate for civic freedoms, and they can do this collectively, which can help to avoid retaliatory action in places where these rights are not enshrined in law. And then finally, companies can take action around supporting human rights defenders. And I just want to say a word about the role of human rights defenders. These are people who speak out on behalf of the rights of others. They can include journalists, trade union organizers, environmental activists, really anyone who's speaking out to advocate for rights. And they are especially important in sounding the alarm when civic freedoms are being repressed and for advocating for specific actions to counter this, preventative and mitigation measures, in other words. So companies can take action to support these important partners in protecting human rights, for example, by not engaging in retaliation or harassment of such people. This would include, for example, refraining from what are called SLAP suits, strategic litigation against public participation. And of course, companies can and should be setting expectations of their business partners that they will also respect the rights and the role of human rights defenders in this larger ecosystem. So we too, BSR in partnership with CSIS, will be convening a roundtable discussion on March 7, looking to flesh out the ways in which companies can protect civic freedoms and support civic space as a critical role of enabling democracy. And of course, these inputs will then be feeding into the discussions at the Summit for Democracy. So those BSR members on the line, if you're interested in participating in that, you can reach out to me directly. Otherwise, you can reach out to that email address that I know will be given once more. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Jenny. So, okay, we've thrown a lot of information out there on a lot of different topics, and we're getting some really good questions in the chat, and we've left about 25 minutes or so for Q&A. So as we dive into the questions, I think I'm going to start by sort of taking a step back, because there's a lot of questions about when are the roundtables and who's invited to what, and I want to make sure we cover all of those so people have the really concrete information they're looking for. But I also want to make sure people understand, Johnny and team, your intention in going into this. And so I'm going to pose some of the more ideological or the more philosophical questions up front, just to make sure we're all sort of understanding the U.S. government's framing of this issue. And so I'm going to start with a great question from Salil Tripathi from IHRB. She says, you know, business can and does play a positive role in enabling democracy and respect for human rights, but it also does play a disruptive role, busting sanctions, bypassing boycotts, selling intrusive technology, providing the means that enable human rights abuses. And often they do both good and bad at the same time in different countries. I apologize, Salil. Making business an ally is a good goal, but disregarding its adverse impacts will make the summit susceptible to criticism and increase distrust among civil society. So, Johnny, I would love to get your reaction to that, how you're thinking about the framing, and then if others would like to come in on that, you're more than welcome to. Johnny, over to you.
I'm actually both glad and I was slightly nervous about zeroing in on this one because I've been turning it over in my head ever since it popped up in the chat. My view on this is that, number one, the point is absolutely right. Like business, like every other sector that we would be discussing in the context of the summit, it can be a force for good. It can be at least an enabler of the ill. There's no question of that. And the idea of the private sector is obviously a sprawling and variegated concept in the first place. The thing is, to me, we can't use the summit to solve, like, really, it is too ambitious to use the summit to solve the existential, like, enormous ways in which business can be co-opted by authoritarian regimes, or even the ways in which authoritarian regimes will use the full range of powers at their disposal to essentially co-opt business towards their larger authoritarian ends. But what we can use this for is to, like, make some positive good, like focus on the art of the possible. And I think that actually can cover both sides of the ledger that the Salil was referring to, which is companies like, if companies are willing to come with realistic commitments to the table, it could be in the vein of affirmative new things they can do. And it could be in the vein of, like, battening down the hatches on ways in which, like, their efforts or the efforts of others in the private sector can be exploited by governments with ill intentions. So, you know, that's at the heart of many of, say, the anti-corruption commitments that Shannon was talking about, or at least the kinds of commitments we would seek. Like, it's meant to stamp out some of the ways in which, often inadvertently, there's a secondary effect, business activity is used to prop up an authoritarian regime and or to repress a population. And you could make a case like that across any of these lines of effort. So to me, it is really not about just like emphasizing the positive or taking a doggedly glass half full view of the issue. It's about looking at like, well, how can we use this to make a reasonable amount of positive good? And so reinsert all appropriate caveats about timelines and what's achievable within the context of this summit. But I think there's a real opportunity, and certainly it has been the case that for the governments involved, for foundations involved, like having this platform of the summit, sometimes this deadline of the summit, has been useful in shaking loose positive, tangible things that might not have happened otherwise. So that's our framing of it. But I would absolutely accept the basic premise of the question that this cuts in both directions. Over.
Thanks, Johnny. Let me just see if anyone else wants to come in on that particular question. Some of you have been working in this space a very long time, so. Okay, then we're going to move on to a couple other sort of related questions. I'm gonna pair a couple together. One is from Kendall Salcito, who says, authoritarian governments offer companies strong incentives to violate labor rights and disincentives for empowering workers. And so is the US government considering both carrots and sticks to counter this influence? And love to hear more about that. And there's a question down below, Dr. Kwakong Tran, who says, what about the legal responsibilities when companies are complicit in the violation of human rights, such as restrictions on freedom of speech? So I wonder if some of our US government colleagues, Shannon and Molly, for example, or Johnny, if you want to come back in, would like to speak to sort of what are the consequences when companies do engage in violations, and sort of that interplay the US government thinks between the carrots and the sticks on some of these issues.
Yeah, thanks, Marty. I'd love to talk about carrots and sticks when it comes to labor rights in particular. I'll start with the carrots because that's the more positive. But I mean, just yesterday, I was with about 20 CEOs and the vice president on the Central America Forward, which is the call to action around private sector investment in Northern Central America. And the three countries of Northern Central America are fraught with, labor rights abuse. That's one of the regions where there's the highest assassination of labor leaders. And I think one of the things where we saw real potential and real progress yesterday, there was a new pledge around good governance and good jobs. So these companies that are not only investing in the region, but doing so with a commitment to create jobs, but to create good jobs with worker rights. And they're getting a lot of support and a lot of engagement with the US government to do so. So that kind of partnership, I think, is one thing I would underscore. And I think there's a number of examples of this. I'll mention some of the things that my colleagues are doing, including USAID in Lesotho, where they've partnered with private sector companies and trade unions and women's rights organizations on a groundbreaking binding agreement to prevent and address gender-based violence and harassment in the garment sector there. And there are numerous other examples, some on smaller and some are larger scales, where we're doing a lot of partnership, both in the sort of thinking space, but also around technical assistance. Where I work at Department of Labor, we provide a lot of technical assistance, both to worker rights organizations, but also to national and partnerships with international employers to address things like forced labor and supply chains to improve their compliance with national laws, and to work with governments as well on their enforcement and inspection. Just to very briefly, even though I don't have the timing information, it's very fitting that the American Apparel and Footwear Association is going to host the labor rights focus event on the call to action, because a lot of the best examples we've seen actually have come from the garment sector, where multinational brands have very willingly entered into binding agreements on worker rights. And we have some really good examples from around the world. On the sticks, we also have a lot of tools, right? I will not speak for the USTR, but our trade tools are some of our strongest. So where there are violations of worker rights, and I can point to the USMCA in Mexico, we have a mechanism to investigate and rapidly respond to cases of workers' freedom of association being violated. And that can come from reports from workers, and we immediately work with the Mexican authorities to make sure that those cases are rectified. There are also a really sort of acute cases of forced labor, withhold release orders, where when a product is suspected of being produced with forced labor, it is not allowed to enter the United States. It's held at the port by CBP. And of course, almost a year ago, in fact, 2 or 3 weeks after the first Summit for Democracy, President Biden signed into law the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which has a rebuttable presumption that anything made in that region is probably made with forced labor and should not enter into the United States. So those are just some of the sort of sticks that we have. But we do a lot of engagement before we get to the sticks to make sure that products with major labor rights violations don't enter the country.
Thanks, Molly. Shannon, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I wanted to jump in from the anti-corruption perspective, which is to say, it also relates to the prior question about, the private sector being a force for good and a force for ill. It's both, right? And it really depends on the context and the company, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to accept that the private sector is not a monolith. So let's just sort of caveat that as we talk about the private sector. But with that said, in terms of incentives, I think there's some pretty natural incentives in place for the private sector to engage in ways that counter corruption. Number one, it keeps costs down because they're not being inflated by people, siphoning things off and putting money in their pocket. We've also heard from a number of executives that it also makes it more predictable in terms of what are they getting in their supply chain. So there's better sort of business continuity and predictability. And then finally, in countries that control corruption, there's money to be made, right? There are better investment environments. And so I think they're pretty natural incentives. We don't necessarily need to sort of create carrots per se. In terms of the sticks, of course, we have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which penalizes, U.S. businesses that are engaged in corruption. As a development agency, though, USAID is working with a number of countries to try to get them to strengthen their legal architecture in order to make the offering and taking of bribes illegal. And then, of course, part of what we do in the US government is to try to ensure that there's accountability for engagement and corruption, and strengthening bodies that are in place to detect it, to investigate it, to prosecute it, or to pursue other avenues for redress. So it is really important, I think, when you're talking about corruption prevention, to acknowledge that part of prevention is holding people accountable for when they're engaging in this behavior.
Thanks, Shannon. So we've got a whole slew of questions that are very specific on sort of logistics and organization. So let's get down to brass tacks for a minute. Johnny, I'm going to turn it back to you. Walk us through the calendar for the next 2 months. What are the engagements that are coming up that businesses are invited to participate in? And what is the kind of timeline and progression that you see that taking place in?
Yeah, I was just going to propose I can try and tackle several of these in something like chronological order and see how many I can get done. In the first place, as folks have mentioned, not to endlessly repeat our contact information, but the easiest way to get started on exploring involvement is just send a note to summitprivatesector@state.gov, and our State Department colleagues can funnel that to either can work with you directly on what it is you're interested in, or can funnel you off to one of the 4 convening organizations who are organizing roundtables. I will also say, just to touch on I think the last question about other ways the private sector can get involved. There's a lot else substantively, even outside the program of the summit. So, for example, many of the new programs under the Presidential Initiative for Democratic Renewal have private sector components built into them. That's on our website. These democracy cohorts, which are multi-stakeholder working groups of governments and civil society, and often companies getting together to do a thing on a topic central to democracy. They're core to the work of this process in between summits, and they'll outlive the summit in many cases. Also on our website, so we can use the central email address to put you in the right place depending what it is you're interested in. But once we've heard from whoever is interested, you can also do it by going straight to Jason or Jenny or whoever it is already. It's perfectly fine as well. Each of them will organize a roundtable to start to like take stock of what companies are considering, to work with you, within the bounds of their own capacity. I don't want to overstretch anybody here, on what would be most helpful, how it can be refined, how some of these commitments might actually dovetail with each other, what they might ask of the USG as a partner. And the four, so those, you've heard the dates for some of them. I think others don't have the date yet, but they will soon. It's all like within the next month. And we're trying to leave at least a reasonable amount of time between that roundtable and the summit itself, which is again March 28th through 30th. So we will funnel those four dialogues in together, along with, if we hear one-off things that don't quite fit into one of those four buckets, that's fine too. And we're designing the event right now. I don't have an exact agenda on what the March 28th event, what the run of show will be, but a few different panels. I fully expect, like, the most important priority to me is to provide a platform for the really sincere, ambitious, helpful commitments that we hear, or the processes that these roundtables launch, or that you all launch. And so we'd like to use that event to foreground that. There's also space to talk about things that businesses are already doing to advance democracy or human rights or anti-corruption, within reason. We're not trying to put on a big infomercial, but like to show best practices that others could or should emulate. There's a question about how else to plug in into the summit. Oh, and I think I said earlier, we would pair that event with some form of press release or fact sheet or something like that would capture this in a more enduring way in writing, capture the commitments that are made. There's a question about where else the private sector might exist in the summit program besides on that event on day 0. There are sprinklings of it throughout. On day 1, it's basically just heads of state speaking with a few like top global activists. So I wouldn't principally expect private sector on day 1. On day 2, each of the 5 co-hosts will be hosting a marquee event. And I don't feel the need to be coy about what they're planning. We are doing one on tech and democracy. The Netherlands is doing one on media freedom with an element of information integrity. South Korea is doing one on anti-corruption. Zambia is doing one on election integrity. And Costa Rica is doing one on youth political participation. So those are each sprawling concepts. They're all developing these on their own, and we're trying not to micromanage how those governments, conceive of each event. Each, I expect, will have private sector speakers in one form or another. I know that ours will, the tech one. If you're interested in getting in touch with one of the co-host governments, again, it's probably easiest also to just express that in an email to the same state address. But frequently, we're able to make a connection between an interested outside actor and one of our co-hosts, if there's a natural marriage there, whether it's as a speaking role or just to give advice on shaping the agenda or a deliverable or something else you might have in mind. Checking on these, I think that ticks off the things that I had at least jotted to myself from the chat, but I'm happy to delve on any of them.
Thanks, Johnny. Appreciate it. One that just came in just quickly, private sector from all countries can participate, right? Not just US companies.
Of course.
Okay.
In this undertaking, for the sake of general simplicity, like I expect most of the companies we'll deal directly with will be American companies. Just it's the nature of these things. That is not like a rule or anything like that. And in fact, the more international, the happier we are. The more international the participants, the happier we are.
Great, thanks. So I'm just gonna see if I can recap what your instruction to private sector folks who are interested in joining is that starts from emailing this email summit private sector at state.gov and indicating an interest in engagement. State will then serve as a clearinghouse to put companies in touch with either the organizers of these 4 roundtables or CSIS and yourselves as organizing the main summit event and answering any other questions that they might have about cohort involvement and other things like that. Is that a good wrap-up statement of sort of how you want that engagement to begin?
That's correct, with only the addition that we're not incredibly doctrinaire about using that email address. So if you already have a relationship with GNI or with Shannon or whoever, like by all means, just go to them directly and we'll figure it out.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Well, we will type that email into the chat as well, or into the Q&A so folks can see it. I'm just going to take moderator's privilege for a minute to say a word about the CSIS pieces of this, because folks are also welcome to get in touch with us. As we mentioned, Jenny and I will be hosting at the Civic Space Roundtable, and we'll share more details about that in the coming days as we pin down the agenda and the dates. But we will also, as Johnny said, be hosting an event on the 28th, the details of which are still being worked out. But we do welcome private sector engagement and as we shape that agenda. And so, equally appreciate folks who companies that want to step forward and indicate they have something they want to announce, something they want to share, or spotlight a particular topic. As we formulate that agenda, it's certainly helpful to know what's on the minds of companies and what they're thinking about in terms of angles for participation. So feel free to be in touch with that as we work out the details of that, including the timing and all of those details. We have a couple more minutes, so I'm just going to see one last scan to see if anybody wants to add any questions to the chat, and let's just see if we missed any.
Hey, Marty, can I jump in with one more email address to flag for folks?
Absolutely.
So I mentioned that USAID launched the Combating or Countering Transnational Corruption Grand Challenge. To give folks a sense of what that is, like, grand challenges are a vehicle that we use when they're really thorny, complex problems, and we don't necessarily know what the answers to them are, or even where to find the problem solvers that know how to answer those questions. And I think it's should be apparent that transnational corruption is one of those extremely difficult issues. And so what the Grand Challenge allows us to do is to partner with the private sector in a variety of ways. So a company could come in and be like a full strategic partner for the entire Grand Challenge, which is focused on countering illicit finance and trafficking in commodities, corruption and global supply chains, improving sort of integrity within the public and private sectors. And so, you can partner with us at the most strategic level and really sort of guiding and driving the kinds of challenges that we put out and the kinds of problems that we're trying to solve. We could also have people engaging on a specific activity within the Grand Challenge. It would be great if folks could flag market gaps for us that we're trying to solve through the Grand Challenge, or sort of testing solutions that innovators come up with. Judging various competitions, serving as judges in our competitions, contributing to prize pools, et cetera, et cetera. Like, it is it's a really diverse vehicle. And so if anyone is interested in learning more about that, there's a separate website, which is challengecorruption@usaid.gov. And we'd be happy to really talk with you about those opportunities.
Thanks for flagging that, Shannon. I appreciate it. We have a couple questions that have come in. I just want to make sure we're responding to. One is for the membership organizations and the folks that are engaging companies who might not know they're interested until they see these topics laid out. Are you going to post sort of publicly when these roundtables are taking place? Like, how are folks going to find out when they're actually scheduled? Is that going to be through the organizations organizing them, or is that going to go up on the Summit website? I don't know, Johnny, if you know the answer to that, or. Yeah.
I guess I don't know when we will post those. We've not wanted to force the hand too early of the convening organizations, and they can figure out when they want to hold these. But I think one important point generally is that to get in touch with interest in principle is not to sign a commitment in blood to like to overhaul your business practice or to be involved in any way. So the easiest thing right now is, if you're somewhat interested, just let us know and in what topic. And if that roundtable hasn't already scheduled its date, or like, they're all going to have to send out invites. And so it would be good to just know your hypothetical interest, and they can be in direct touch with you. I think that's probably the best way to do it.
Great. Thank you for that. And I think that we have a question on universities and higher education institutions. I'm not sure from Jin if that was directed specifically at the Corruption Grand Challenge or more broadly. Shannon, I don't know if you all have a role for universities and higher ed in your initiative in particular.
Yeah, in fact, like there are so many different ways of people, for people to partner, and not just in the Grand Challenge, but also in the financial transparency and integrity cohort that I mentioned, which is a multi-stakeholder platform. So if there are people who have expertise in certain areas that can be mobilized in order to address financial transparency and integrity issues, we would very much welcome that participation. So again, if there's interest, we can sort of channel it through that central website and follow up on exactly how to plug in.
Great. I think we've gone through all the questions that have come in through the chat. The roundtables will they be virtual, hybrid, or in person? Got in under the wire, and I think that answer is probably to be determined still in each case. So it sounds like that those details are still being worked out. But I think the right thing to do is email this, and I'm going to put it back in the chat for everyone. summitprivatesector@state.gov, so that everybody has it to get the details of those roundtables when they do get finalized. We're just about at time, but I just want to stop and let anyone who would like to come in from our panelists who has any kind of closing thoughts or things you wanted to add into the conversation, do so for just a quick minute before we wrap up. So let me just do a quick round the room and see if anybody wants to add anything. And Johnny, if you would like, I'll give you the last word. Looks like no. Jason, you want to come in?
Yeah, no, just to say that we are still, to confirm, we're still putting the details together on the tech private sector roundtable. So, check us out online or on our Twitter account for more information about that. But I'll also feel free to reach out. And thanks again for convening this conversation.
And I'll chime in that we hope to use that civic space roundtable really as an opportunity to surface the different tactics that companies are utilizing. So I think we do want to showcase good examples, but it's also a chance for us to learn from each other and make recommendations to the wider business community about actions they can take. So I think it should be a fun brainstorm.
Great. Johnny, last word to you.
A tactical things first, without dictating terms to the organizers, I would expect there to be at least a virtual option for all of the roundtables, just in that we don't want physical presence in Washington to be the gating issue here that allows someone to get in on the platform. So I think hybrid or all virtual is very, very likely to be the answer to that question. And then just generally, I would zoom out to say, we really want to think of this as a dialogue and not us talking at you, and certainly not us just asking you to do things that we take and promote and then disappear. So we're really looking forward to talking in the context of the roundtables, but also in the context of working through everything that comes out of this process, in going back and forth with you on how the tools of the U.S. government, current or imagined, the sort that Molly and Shannon laid out, how they can dovetail with the problems with the efforts the private sector is taking and with solving the problems that folks are raising here. I think there's a lot of ways that we could probably unify our efforts better, and I would like this to be a platform for kind of ongoing discussion of how to do that. So that is slightly contingent on exactly what comes out of this, and I don't want to prejudge what's most of interest. But it really is a two-way street. And I think that the summit and everything associated with it can be useful in forcing us to take more ambitious action on this and a million other fronts, to advance democracy. I have seen that happen throughout the history of the summit process. And I think this is no different. There's a lot of opportunity. So anyway, thank you all so much for listening. And Marty and CSIS, thank you so much for your moral authority, convening power, and willingness to take on extra burdens to help a good cause.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you all of our speakers for being here, for sharing your expertise and your ideas and your time with us, and to our participants for taking the time out of your schedules to be here. This is a really important issue, as we've said, and I hope that this is the beginning of a longer process of engagement that runs to the Democracy Summit, but also well beyond. And it's certainly an issue that we at CSIS will continue to be very focused on. So I want to thank you all of you for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.